Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may find yourself around the world, and welcome to this event hosted by the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. My name is Harry Verhoeven, and I'll be the moderator and host for today. It is my particular pleasure to be hosting yet another installment in our series on African perspectives on climate and climate adaptation, and to take a little bit of a more closer look at Egypt, the host, of course, of the next meeting of the Conference of the Parties under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, a very important meeting that is due to be hosted in just a few weeks from now in Sharm el-Sheikh. But we thought it would be worthwhile to take a closer look at developments internal to Egypt and to see what we may well learn from developments in the sphere of energy, urbanization, water management, awareness raising, participatory governance, and other key questions as they pertain again to climate and climate adaptation. Now, before we get into our discussion here, let me quickly repeat a number of housekeeping rules. This event is being live streamed, it is on the record, and it is open to the press. What we'll do is we'll first have introductory remarks by each of our guests, who I'll introduce momentarily. And as questions, comments, disagreements pop up, please put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I'll be moderating those, trying to direct those to different speakers for their reaction, their thoughts on that. We very much hope you'll be able to take this conversation forward here, as well as in, of course, other forums and future occasions, but do make good use of that. Now, as I said, we've managed to assemble three very eminent speakers drawn from a range of different professions and backgrounds to talk about this important subject of Egypt and questions of climate adaptation, environmental management more broadly. The first we'll hear from is Dr. Mohammed Nada, who I think got his PhD from the Netherlands, if I'm not mistaken, from Erasmus University. He's currently a senior urban specialist at the World Bank, having previously served for UN Habitat and Care International, and he'll be starting us off. Then we'll turn to Dr. Lama Al-Hatho at Johns Hopkins University here in the United States. Lama has also some background at the IFC, where I think she worked to almost a decade, if I'm not mistaken, Lama, as well as, of course, at the Climate Action Network. And she too has a PhD, actually also from Erasmus University, if I'm not mistaken, in the Netherlands. So we're quite fortunate to have two Egyptian alum of that same university here for our discussion today. And finally, last but not least, we'll hear from Mohammed Kamal, who got his education at the University of Leeds, who is the co-managing director of Greenish, and he'll be telling us a little bit more also about civil society and its engagement with a range of important issues as they pertain to climate and changing both attitudes as well as practices and governance in the Egyptian sphere. So without further ado, let me turn that over to you, Mohammed, for your introductory comments. I think you have some slides to share. So please go ahead, and thanks once again for being here and for being generous with your time.
Thanks a lot, and it's actually a pleasure to be with you all. I don't know if you can see my screen.
Not yet. We can see you, but not yet your screen.
You cannot see the presentation?
No, at the moment we can't see the presentation. We just see you. I'm quickly checking whether you have all the right permissions. There we are. You're starting. There we are. Yeah, we can.
Perfect. Can you see it now?
We can.
Yeah, excellent. So, my input actually would be about work that the World Bank is doing through in collaboration with the Egyptian government, Ministry of Housing, Ministry of Local Development, and through funding from SECO, the Swiss Economic Affairs within Switzerland, and a number of Egyptian agencies ranging from CAPMUS, which is the Census Authority, the General Organization for Physical Planning, the National Planning Institute, New Urban Community Authority, and the Housing and Building Research Institute. So it's a number of agencies that are coming together to produce an atlas for Egyptian cities that look at sustainability at the heart of that atlas. In this atlas, we focus on the wider sustainability issue, but we zoom into climate change, given the importance of it of the Egyptian from the Egyptian government perspective. The atlas start with looking at Egypt and where it stands in relation to the Middle East, and obviously the contribution of MENA is relatively, compared to other regions, is very limited compared in relation to CO2 emission. Then the atlas would zoom into the urbanization status. It would look at how many the urbanization trends in Egypt, briefly describe it, look at the economic role of cities, and show why cities are actually in the heart of productivity in Egypt, and how much they are contribution to the GDP per capita, but also how they are contributing to the CO2 emission compared to nationwide, the national level. The atlas also presents, at different levels. It looked at the national level, then it zoomed into the regional level, then it zoomed into the governorate level, and then it zoomed at 251 cities in Egypt, basically every city in Egypt. It looked at different areas. It looked like air quality, like heat island within cities. It looked at temperature rise and its trend, and so on. I'll go through some of these issues in my presentation. So as I mentioned, it starts with presenting a brief about where cities are in Egypt, where are the population density in Egypt, and as you can see, definitely Cairo is in the heart of population density, or and where it is concentrated, and also the Delta, it's very much populated and dense, as you can see. If we look at urban growth over the last 40 years, again, you can see from this map that Greater Cairo region is actually expanding very rapidly, and to some extent the Delta. We then zoom into where actually CO2 emission is happening, both methane and CO2. And again, not surprisingly, it's the Delta and Greater Cairo region is in the heart where actually CO2 is being produced. And Delta, of course, and some of the agricultural projects, massive land reclamation projects, are also contributing to the methane production. Then we start to look at, what is the summer surface temperature across the country. So we start to, as you can see, the northeast of the country is relatively the hottest compared to the rest of the country. As you can see, where temperature in some parts during the summer can reach to 60 Celsius. Precipitation and rains is definitely as expected. It's on the north where Mediterranean coast get most of the rain, as you can see. Sea level rising, these are some maps that show implication of sea level rising on Alexandria and Delta, and our estimates are suggesting that between 12 to 32% of the Delta can drown by 2060 if no major actions are taken to protect and safeguard the Delta from sea level rising. Again, as you can see in Alexandria, a similar trend. We then look in the atlas into, of course, I'm moving very fast given the time limitation. So I'm hoping that if there's any questions, I'm happy to address them in the Q&A session. So here you look at the air quality and the PM 2.5 concentration, and you can see definitely it's very high. It's not only related to pollution, city driven, but it's also related to sea dust, the dust particles coming from the desert. It also contributes significantly to the PM 2.5 concentration. We also in the atlas not only look at climate change related implications, but we also look at natural hazards. So here we're looking at earthquakes, hazards. We look at landslides, and you can see parts of the Sinai, especially the southeast part of Sinai is definitely a significant area that can be affected by it. Then we look at scenarios, and this is the old scenarios, but we also look at the new scenarios and their implication, that shared socioeconomic pathways. And then we start to see what if, these how these scenarios can affect Egypt in relation to a number of areas. So as you can see on the far left, you will see the baseline, Egypt's almost now, which is between 95, the mean temperature between 95 and 2014, and then three scenarios, based the three scenarios that I have mentioned, and you can see there is a difference between the SPP 1 1.9 and the 2 4.5 and the 3 to 7 scenario. The same you will find also at the change in temperature, and it's the likelihood, of course, with the more advanced SSPs, you will find a change and more added temperature or extreme temperature that will be seen. Number of days that have temperature above 35, again increasing. On precipitation and rain, we see the projections are that while the north of Egypt will continue to still receive the highest level of rain compared to the rest of Egypt, however, it is decreasing compared to the current baseline. The only exception would be slight increase in the southeast of Egypt, in the area of Halayb and Shalatin and the Red Sea coast toward the south, where there might be slight increase in rain, but it's not very significant. What we are also seeing is that while rain will be decreasing according to these scenarios and projections, however, the extreme rains and extreme weather condition will be seen as more massive. As you can see in the second the map on the middle, also drought in general will be significantly higher. So what I presented is basically what you can see at the national level, and then we start to zoom into each region. And Egypt is made up or divided into 7 economic regions, and each region will have somewhere between 3 to 7 governorates. So we explain what is the region made of, what are the cities that are there within the region, and then we zoom even further to the governorate and do the same. And then we start to zoom into the city. And here we are zooming almost on every city in Egypt, where we start to provide a very brief description about what is the city economic development, what are the urban expansion of it. We present the map that you can see, which is the land use map that we were able to acquire from the General Organization for Physical Planning. And we started to do further analysis on the map to see what is the percentage of land that is dedicated for economic development, services, etc., etc. Where is the urban expansion areas? Where is the informal areas, and so on. We start to look at population distribution, and this is different maps from different cities that you can see a variance between one city and another, and within cities as well. We start to we zoom into the urban growth within the city, and as you can see here, from 85 until 2015, the periphery. This city, by the way, is Mansoura city in the heart of Delta. So here we start to look at the floods, and the areas that are tend to be blue and dark blue are the areas that can get more rain and more flooding as a result of alluvial floods. And these are examples of other cities. Surface temperature, again, temperature, of course, is not homogeneous at the city level. Different parts of the city would face different heat islands and differentiated heat between different parts of the city. And you can see in other cities different temperatures being recorded. And then we start to speak about the heat island effect and its implication on the city and so on. Again, we do that for air quality. We do that on sea level rising, and we do that for all the coastal cities, the 21 Mediterranean cities on the coast. And the blue color that you can see in Alexandria, this is Alexandria. This is the area that will be affected by potential sea level rising in 2050. We do the same for tsunami. It's not related to climate change, but as a potential natural hazard, this is what We also look at the ultraviolet radiation and by city, by month, which are the areas and which city are affected more by ultraviolet radiation. And then we end the city by having a matrix of indicators for the first time at the city level, where we start to zoom into economic development, human development and quality of life, environment sustainability, and so on. And we start to see how the city ranked in relation to the 251 cities in terms of poverty, in terms of Gini coefficient, number of households connected to different types of infrastructure, renewable energy, and so on and so on. So that's basically a very quick overview of the atlas. Currently, as you can see, it's more descriptive than analytical, and the main focus of the atlas is just to give a quick snapshot of decision maker. But what Ministry of Local Development and Ministry of Housing and all the stakeholders that we're working with on the government, they are very keen to see what are the type of policies that need to be in place, what are the sort of cross-cutting issues that need to be tackled so that we can enhance urban sustainability and resilience to climate change. And of course, you know, the World Bank strategy for the Middle East recognized eight cross-cutting areas that need to be looked at, in addition to the sectoral areas, as you can see them, which range from participation, integration, interdepartmental coordination, skills, citizen engagement, and so on. So the next steps would be to, once we finish the atlas, and the plan is actually to launch the atlas within the COP. Next step after the COP is basically to engage in a more in-depth diagnostic work, to look at trends in more detail and the type of policies needed, and then to conclude this work with a policy notes that is endorsed by the Egyptian government and civil society, with participation of civil society organization that highlight the exact policies and the actions that the government would like to have. I'll stop here. I'm sorry if I was a bit long.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mohammed, for giving us that comprehensive overview of the important work you've been doing, and fantastic to see this kind of work at the local level, at the city level, moving away from just kind of national aggregates. So extremely interesting and useful. Now let's turn it over to Lama. Lama, you've done a lot of work in the past, especially of course on water issues and their linkages with energy and with food. How do you perceive of some of these big challenges in terms of climatic changes that Egypt is facing, and what is your sense as to some of the responses being given by the private sector, by civil society, by government? What thoughts would you like to share here?
Thank you, Harry. Do we need to exit the presentation to return back to the other mode, or should we remain?
We probably should. Mohammed, can you stop the sharing of that screen whilst Lama launches into her opening intervention?
I have stopped sharing.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. And thank you, Harry, for hosting us, have this very engaging conversation with everyone here. It's definitely a pleasure to be on a panel with such fantastic speakers. I have to say, I know both Dr. Mohammed and Engineer Mohammed Kamal very, very well. So it's a delight and a pleasure and an honor to be on a panel with both of you, I have to say. I think when we talk about climate adaptation specifically, or climate change and the impacts ensuing on Egypt, I mean, Dr. Mohammed gave us a beautiful introduction into what's going to be happening and how that's going to be affecting every single sector, from water to the urban cities, and how that's going to be playing out. And I think that that's crucial in understanding that climate change is cross-cutting, and that all of the sectors are being impacted. So obviously the highlighted ones, whether it be, for example, water, since Egypt is a country that is very highly water scarce, is going to be something that is going to impact the water sector per se specifically. But water, as we know, is cross-cutting and will be affecting the agricultural sector. So it affects food security. We talk about urban settings and how that affects that. We talk about the energy sector and the water energy nexus, and how that also has a large role to play in how those impacts are going to ensue. One of the biggest problems, I would say, is being posed currently, and this is not just on Egypt, but on a global level, when we talk about adaptation and mitigation, is that only 20% of climate finance globally is currently going towards adaptation, and 80% is going to mitigation. which sounds promising, of course. We can't have mitigation without adaptation. But when we talk about this being an African COP, when we talk about developing countries, when we talk about least capacity in terms of finances and capacity building, there is a very serious struggle and need for adaptation to take place in developing countries, and particularly in Egypt and in Africa. That being said, when we talk about adaptation, so how do we capitalize on it, and how do we make it, well, bankable? Because the honest truth is that one of the largest reasons why mitigation takes on the reign supreme in terms of 80% of the finance is that at the end of the day, it is bankable. There is a return on revenue and there is a return on investments for private sector, for MDBs, and for otherwise to actually get back their money. And there was actually a very interesting proposition that was being made by Egypt's climate champion, Dr. Mahmoud Mohiddin, who actually made a statement claiming that if we're to prioritize our climate finance in terms of adaptation and mitigation, is that we should actually focus that the government level, that the public sector finances and money should go towards adaptation, whereas the private sector, any other finances that come in that respect, should be focusing on mitigation, because that's what attracts them. That's where the money comes in. Whether we talk about solar energy projects with a high return of revenue, or wind projects, or any mitigation project that does have a strong ROI. Adaptation is not the case. Our adaptation generally does not have a very strong bankable or attractive bankability in that aspect. That being said, however, I will say that IFC is looking, the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank, does focus quite a bit on how to incentivize looking at how adaptation can in fact be bankable, or in fact how to invest in adaptation specifically. So looking at the private sector in terms of different projects. So obviously currently one of the leading things that Egypt is doing right now is implementing desalination technologies across their coastlines, across the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea for tourist resorts and otherwise, to minimize, of course, the water intake that is occurring from the grid, from the national grid, from the Nile River, and to maximize water that is coming in from coastal resorts. But then, of course, we have the issue of it coming from solar energies, which is a beautiful mix between that happening, sort of a mitigation adaptation potential, both two in one. There are, of course, ecological impacts that we need to consider, whether it be the brine that's coming in, the brine refuse from the desalination plants or otherwise into the marine ecosystems, and how that's being challenged. So we do need to consider that when we talk about sort of the entire assessment of those projects. But there is potential for bankability when we talk about adaptation. Now, that being said, we also need to shift our perspective on what we think about what we mean by adaptation. For the longest time, when we've thought about adaptation in the sector, we've talked about heat-resistant crops, or climate-resistant or salt-resistant crops from saltwater intrusion, or coastal zone management, for instance, and on Alexandria in the Delta areas, building barrages or different kinds of coastal zone management protection barrier systems to protect from saltwater intrusion. And that being said, those are fine. There's a many traditional thinking in the way that we've thought about adaptation. But more and more, particularly in the last few years, we're starting to see that adaptation needs to be modified, needs to be thought of in a different paradigm. And with many of the extreme weather events that have been occurring both in Egypt and across the region, I would have to say across the MENA region, we're seeing impacts of floods in our cities. And Dr. Mohammed gave us wonderful examples of many of those floods that are devastating our cities in horrible ways. We've actually also seen that in many of our urban settings, slum areas, for instance, that are not connected to whether it be sewage or water or sanitation services, often end up having sanitation self-built septic tanks at the bottom of within their houses, and end up being, well, self-built at best. When many of these impacts and with extreme weather events occur, what ends up happening is of course the flushing out of from these floods and these heavy rainfalls ends up causing disastrous waterborne diseases, and that end up causing disastrous impacts across the entire communities of the slum areas. In addition to, of course, affecting households, demolishing the households altogether. So what the problem we end up having in urban settings is, because we're in water scarce countries, or Egypt is a water scarce country specifically in a region that is also water scarce, we've never planned to have stormwater drainage facilities or infrastructure being built in our cities, simply because we've never needed it. The rainfall trends, as Dr. Mohammed very, very clearly showed and indicated to us, show that we really don't have that much precipitation to invest in stormwater drainage infrastructure for the longest time. But with the extreme impacts of these weather events, we're starting to see that maybe there is a dire need for us to begin to invest in stormwater drainage infrastructure. And the different modeling and training of thinking of paradigm shift here is that adaptation actually also potentially could include and mean investing in stormwater drainage infrastructure in our urban cities, because that's where that kind of adaptation is needed. And again, it's not necessarily bankable, but it is necessary to begin to adapt to climate change when we move to this new world order, actually, in which we're headed towards. So that being said, when it comes to climate adaptation, we really need to think about it in a different paradigm. Now, the second component of what I would like to add here includes much of the work that I've also done with engineer Mohammed Kamel through his NGO at Greenish, and as well as many of the NGOs across Egypt, is in fact looking at how the civil society and civil society engagement is imperative in any form of climate adaptation project across the country, whether it be adaptation or in mitigation for that matter. But since this is the focus of this is adaptation, we'll focus on that. Since the beginning of this year, as we've sort of begun preparing for the COP and how to engage civil society in the COP, one of the biggest paradigms is there was very little knowledge about how different stakeholders or environmental NGOs and movements have actually been engaged within this space in terms of whether it be in the water field, the agricultural field, biodiesel, and many exist, but they're all technically working in silos and many don't know what the other is doing. And this is a very big problem, as if since we're heading towards the COP and having a network of environmental NGOs that are able to discuss with one another, are able to come have somewhat of a common cause with one another on an issue such as climate or otherwise, or even water or ag or other, providing that training in terms of climate change preparedness for the COP, not just to engage at the COP, but also to up and to the COP, is a very important thing, which is something that I had the privilege and the liberty to be able to work with many of the NGOs to prepare them for that kind of engagement. So that being said, making sure that there is stakeholder inclusion in the process for any project or for any initiative or climate policy being investigated on a national or district or local level is absolutely necessary. We do have the NGOs, we do now have the capacity, we do have the know-how, and many of them are very, very eager, very excited to be engaged and need a platform, need a voice to be able to speak. And on that, I think it's enough of me speaking and allow the NGOs to speak. So I'll give the floor to my colleague, Engineer Mohammed.
Excellent transition, Lama. Thank you so much for those comments. Very thought-provoking. I mean, your call for rethinking what we understand by adaptation in Egypt, as well as, of course, in other contexts, I think hugely important as we move away, indeed, from as you said, this very traditional approach that people have taken, where they imagine these, as you said, these kind of huge barrages against sea level rises, or even the vaccination of livestock, to a much more fine-grained understanding of this, factoring in, as you said, on the one hand, the new risks that Mohammed outlined, but also thinking about the social and the human component to this. Adaptation is a fundamentally social process, of course. I think that's extremely well taken. But Engineer Mohammed, over to you. We're very keen to get your thoughts, and especially given Lama's great assist there on the importance of civil society. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be on this panel, and thank you very much for the introduction as well. I'm facing some issues because there's construction ongoing near my house, so the internet is not very consistent. But I've joined at the moment from my phone. I do have a presentation. I might join from a second computer just to show it. But let me start in the beginning by giving an introduction about myself. Okay, perfect. Now you should be able to see my share screen in just a second.
Excellent, we can.
Perfect, okay. Sorry about that. I'll take it from here then to start formally. So my name is Mohammed Kamal. I'm the co-director for an organization called Greenish. And Greenish was an organization that was originally started off as a youth-based initiative that was focusing on environmental issues back in 2016, and then became formally registered in 2017. Greenish started its journey working primarily to try and raise the awareness of youth and different stakeholders in Egypt, but primarily youth, on environmental issues. And this was done through engaging activities such as cleanups, but also through art, because art can be a very good tool for communication and connecting people to issues that might not be very tangible in front of them. Over time, we transitioned a bit, and in 2019, we started to work on primarily environmental education, but also environmental research and climate change research. And in 2020, and we also have a program called Greenish Clubs that I'm not going to spend too much time here on, but it works with a lot of youth across many universities in Egypt on environmental awareness. But we started in 2020 working on something called climate narratives and climate engagement. And I'm going to speak more about this later in the presentation. It's extremely important, and it's usually extremely overlooked, especially in the global south. Let's take a step forward, and then we're going to later take a step back. The step forward is we're now in the beginning of 2022, and we knew in the beginning or the end of 2021 that COP27 is coming to Egypt. Historically speaking, the large majority of Egyptian civil society, or the Egyptian civil society space that works on environmental issues, has not been very engaged with climate negotiations or with climate engagement overall. We work a lot on very local specific issues related to environmental issues, and such as environmental pollution, waste pollution, etc., and also environmental conservation. But there hasn't been any prominent climate-based local climate NGOs that take on issues such as climate negotiations and having the voice of Egyptian civil society or Egyptian communities at the COP or at these negotiation tables. With the COP27 coming to Egypt, we started a series of workshops, which Dr. Lem has actually led in the very beginning in training a large number. It was started off in the first workshop as 25 and then became 30. And then the third workshop was 35. And it kept on growing, of Egyptian environmental civil society to capacitate our sort of understanding of how do we engage with COP27. A lot of us are not interested in the future COPs. We're interested in making the most out of the opportunity that comes to Egypt. And I'm going to stress on this a lot. The space provided by COP27 is not the event. It is the platform provided across the year with different stakeholders in Egypt that would have never been interested to discuss issues related to climate change, now being interested, now understanding climate change, and now willing to accommodate some of the controversial or sensitive topics that are usually very difficult for us as Egyptian civil society to bring it up. A very quick overview that I don't think is too necessary to stress on. So as I mentioned, historically, not a lot of Egyptian NGOs have access to the COP. Now there's a number of Egyptian NGOs that have got specific access to the COP just for COP27. So this is a temporary form of accreditation. However, most of us are very new to the climate engagement and climate politics overall space. But some of us have tried to come together and try and sort of coordinate our work, or the work that we're going to try to focus on for COP, which I'm going to come to in the next slide. Two key points to raise as well that I wanted to bring up in my presentation is one of the things that we have witnessed as Egyptian civil society, as I bring our perspective in the next slides, is what have we been experiencing over the past year. COP is very close, it's only a month away. So the story of the COP27 buzz will start to slow down. Yes, COP continues after COP27, the Egyptian COP presidency, but the fuss in Egypt will slow down. And one of the things we have sort of struggled with as local organizations has been the sort of engagement with media. A lot of media personnel who approach us, they come with their own assumptions, or they make their assumption on the local context based on one encounter or one opinion. You should never take one opinion for making your assumption on a local situation. Don't even take it from me. You need to make it based on multiple encounters. And you need to understand that there's a local context to every country in the world, including Egypt, which makes certain discussions a little bit complicated. And then the other thing is the lack of climate narratives, or there's a lack of climate engagement space. And I'm probably going to explain this point first before I go into the position paper. So in Egypt, a lot of the narrative built for climate change is not adequately localized. And that is one of the primary challenges we face as Egyptian civil society. We speak about all these impacts, but a lot of the local communities, especially some of them that are vulnerable, do not connect to these communications or to these impacts. And that is largely because the general narrative itself is not sufficiently localized. Even some of the terminology is extremely alien to the local communities. So one of the key things we're trying to adopt is how do we use the right language with different communities. it is very unrealistic to use a separate language for every single different community in Egypt, for the different types of rural communities, for different types of urban communities, etc. So you need some form of methodology that is flexible, also adaptable to the different communities to communicate. Communication is key because you want to get these communities on board. No matter how fancy your adaptation intervention is, for it to be sustained, it needs the local community to be invested. So this was a very quick important point on narratives. And then this brings us to a very important phase that we're sort of going through now as a group of Egyptian civil society, not all of us. We don't represent the general Egyptian civil society space that works on environmental issues, but a group of us. One of the things that we are working on, there's multiple sort of initiatives at the moment to state our position. So what is the Egyptian civil society's view on multiple climate-related issues? And in the slide in front of you are a couple of examples. I don't want to spend too much time here, but to give you quick sort of shots on general positions. Some of them are very consistent with the global sort of civil society space and international NGOs, and some of them are a bit more specific to the context of Egypt. I'm gonna take out 3 of them from this slide, and there's another, and there's a following slide. And also maybe in the end, in the Q&A, I might get a chance to speak a bit more about how this was formulated. And maybe Dr. Lama as well can jump in on that. But first of all, a domestic position. So the concept of decentralized financing for climate action is not a straightforward concept. And as Lama already touched on this point, probably not even a bankable concept, especially because a lot of the bankable projects are mega projects. And when you move closer to adaptation, financing becomes more complicated. Now, if you move towards adaptation and you make it decentralized, where you're saying each community needs a different intervention at a different scale, with different approach, financing just becomes extremely complicated and very unrealistic in the current space we operate in. However, it does not negate or eliminate the fact that we seriously need decentralized financing, or for climate finance specifically. And it needs to go to the vulnerable communities, and it needs to go in a way where they get empowered through the financing. They need to feel part of the solutions, that they're not being handed solutions of some sort. That is a key and a very important point. Decentralized financing doesn't mean we want money away from government. It just means that we want government to decentralize the way they're spending their money. The other point I'll bring up is climate finance overall, and I already spoke about it. There needs to be inclusion of civil society in the way we propose and implement adaptation projects. As simple as that, without any need for complicated or fancy words. The third thing I'll touch light on, or I'll probably discuss from this slide, is water security. So as you probably already know, and was mentioned by Dr. Muhammad, so Egypt has a lot of issues related to water, and our majority of use of water is probably over 92% of domestic water is based on the Nile River. One of the key things, if we are to really resolve the water security issues of Egypt, there are a lot of issues that are transboundary, but one of the key things is how we utilize the water available to us. And there needs to be an enhancement of local governance and local activity, improvement of local infrastructure. When I say the word local, what do I mean? I mean at a rural level, at a village level, at a city level, at a district level. We speak about sort of separating communities in a way when we look at them, because at the moment, the way we consume water is extremely inefficient and extremely wasteful as well. I'll touch on one point here rather than going on all of them. I believe this will be made public, the position paper eventually. It is going through a lot of review from different civil society organizations, so it's taking an incredibly long time to try and come up with one thing that we all can sort of agree on. But one specific point that we hear a lot about recently, especially in the previous 3 editions of the COP, is nature-based solutions. And I think it was championed to an extent during the Glasgow COP26, at COP26 in Glasgow. But I don't think this at the local level in Egypt or at the national level in Egypt is anywhere near our formal discussions yet. So we're still missing the element of, so what actually are the nature-based solutions? How can we start adapting those? And I'll touch upon a specific point here is urban nature-based solutions. We seriously need an urban nature-based solutions. And I'm here voicing the voice of the urban issues and the urban challenges we face in Egypt. Okay, so what other forms of positions are Egyptian civil society taking? Another group of Egyptian civil society that we're also part of has, and this only happened because of COP27, started to work on action for climate empowerment, which was originally part of the UNFCCC or agreement or convention, Article 6, and also Article 12 in the Paris Agreement. And predominantly action for climate empowerment, or climate empowerment in its simplest form, is how can every stakeholder, regardless who they are, be empowered to do their role for climate action. And there are 6 components: education, training, international cooperation, public awareness, public participation, and public access to information. And the group of us have sort of come together and tried to focus really on, okay, we don't really do any of, we don't have an ACE program in Egypt, and a lot of countries don't. Is there a way we can mainstream these components and find ways to mainstream them for different issues? So we're not going to tackle it as, oh, we want to work on climate education. No. The way we want to discuss it is we want to work on climate education in the space of energy. We're going to take it in a topic at a time. And we came with a sort of position statement on our sort of view, and this is only a group of civil society, not all civil society in Egypt, our view towards every component, what needs to be prioritized in Egypt. Oh, I think that was it. So at the end of my presentation, the one thing I want to highlight, or two things I want to highlight. The first thing is, so what is the stance of Egyptian civil society? There are loads of positions being taken. This will all come out during COP. You'll find a number of side events, and I think this can be in a follow-up for this sort of webinar on what positions are Egyptian civil society taking to the global situation and to the local situation. We have key pressing issues in Egypt. And the 3 things I would highlight is water security comes at the top, food security as well. And the third thing is a collection of issues, but they're all focusing on sort of integration of climate action. How do the different stakeholders, how do we align ourselves? How do we integrate overall our climate action? And how do where does civil society fit? The context in Egypt is complicated. The context in Egypt is still growing when it comes to civil society space for engagement. So we're still exploring, and it's crucial to answer this question, the actual role of civil society and where they will fit. I'll probably stop here, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Mohandas Mohammed. That was absolutely excellent. Very much enjoyed that. You put a lot of different pieces on the table, and I'm sure we'll elicit a lot of response also from our audience. Before we turn to some of the questions, let me bring it back to you, Dr. Mohammed. There's both a question in the Q&A that came up, as well as something that occurred to me as I heard Lama and Engineer Mohammed speak. And that's indeed about the importance of the local. So the question from the Q&A is from Anis, and he says, who speaks about the importance of improving the institutional framework in Egypt to essentially be able to use all this fantastic information that you've been gathering, and as you said, that is still largely at the descriptive stage, but which undoubtedly bears many analytical insights within it. How do we do that? What do you see as priorities there? And coupled to that, because I heard this very passionate plea by your other 2 panelists about the importance of local financing and the need to decentralize climate financing. What does that look like from your perspective, the kind of work that you do, that the bank is engaged with? What kind of possibilities do you discern that may respond to some of the needs outlined by Lama and Mohammed?
Thank you so much. Very important questions. And let me start with making a bold statement. Egypt is a very centralized country. MENA is a centralized. If I look at MENA region compared to other regions, it's the most centralized region. And if I look to Egypt within MENA, it's one of the most centralized countries in the region. I completely agree with Engineer Mohammed about the decentralization and availing resources to the local level. But then if I look at local government in Egypt and what are the amount of resources available to local government, it's very limited. Usually somewhere between 10 to 15% of capital investments are done by local government, and the rest is done at the central government. Usually in a country with the size of Egypt, this percentage should minimum need to be 25, 30. This is the the least possible. It should in a country like China, this percentage go to 70%. So one, it's an extremely centralized country. It's also not only centralized, but it's to a great extent is fragmented, meaning that each department, each ministry have its own directorates. It's a deconcentrated mode of decentralization where every ministry more or less, it's the way they prepare budget, the way they prepare their investments is done in a silo system. Governorates and city, in theory, should bring them all together, these sectors together. In reality, there is plenty of limitation. So I think that's the overall picture. Over the last few years, there have been many attempts to tackle this. So one, Ministry of planning, for example, started to create a formula by which it can decentralize and give predictability to central transfers to all governorates and all districts nationwide. I think this is a very important step. The amount didn't change, or it's changing, but it's very small increase. But having predictability of central transfers to the governorates and to the districts, I think is a good step. Minister of Local Development last year have issued a new regulation to introduce climate and environmental interventions at the governorate level and districts in a much clearer way. Was issued, and I think that's a very good progress on that side. Urban planning, I think the Ministry of Housing has been doing lots of, they basically have done strategic plans for almost all cities and all the villages in nationwide. However, climate aspects and the climate lens and the environmental lens at large, I think there is an awareness that it needs to be strengthened, and I think they are working on it at the moment. So Ministry of Environment has been doing trying to clarify what are the eligible, in collaboration with Ministry of Environment Planning, on what are the eligible projects that can be financed at the local level. So in a nutshell, there is lots of activities happening in different ministries, but my honest opinion is, there are much more is needed. The status of centralization in the country is a significant hindrance to what Engineer Muhammad and what Dr. Lama was mentioning about localization and decentralization of the actions, and the ability and the empowerment of local governments to, one, open up to civil society and bring citizens more closer. And I think if I look at the slide that Engineer Muhammad mentioned about access to data, remain to be a big issue in the country. There has been significant improvement in how the government is collecting data, and to some extent how they are sharing this data. But I think what is needed is way beyond what is already taking place. So I think many work is needed for joint up government, a whole of some government at the national level, but at the governorate level to bring all actors together. A clear policy of the government to decentralize and to give more power to cities and districts and villages, as Dr. Lama and Engineer Muhammad were speaking, and to open up the space for civil society and citizens to voice their opinion. There have been many pilots. I myself have been working very closely in Upper Egypt with a major program implemented by the government there, where participation and engagement has been really impressive. But again, this is not, in my view and my knowledge, has not been really mainstream nationwide.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that. Very useful. Perhaps, Lama, let me turn it over to you, both for your thoughts on this. I also see in the chat some questions, for example, by Nilgun, indeed, about the role of the state and the fact that the state takes up a significant portion of the economy. And that, of course, the way, therefore, in which state-owned enterprises are managed and reform themselves or not has a direct impact on water, on energy, on food, on climate readiness. So your thoughts, indeed, about how do we go about some of these reforms, where you see signs of hope, would also be much appreciated.
Thank you, Harry, and thank you, Dr. Muhammad. I think that it's important when we this is a very complex issue, and starting to look at how to classify the debate in terms of public funding and private funding, and how do we decentralize the money and the resources that go towards more local communities versus to state. It's a very complicated and a very complex topic altogether. I think more and more there is this trajectory along the country to head towards a more community-based approach in terms of specifically looking at local level adaptation and mitigation. I think that specifically in mitigation, that is something that is also being focused on quite a bit. If we look at, for instance, many of the sort of the household initiatives of scaling solar, some of these very, the smaller impacts of these smaller scaling solar communities that are raising solar power in areas are generating electricity, feeding it back into the grid again for in a smart grid system, but then again also creating revenue and generating electricity on a small scale for their own households at what's happening there. So it's a start towards a trajectory towards decentralizing and moving away from the national grid in a way that does allow for self-sustaining communities to take place and to build upon it. The same is happening in terms of agriculture, small agricultural communities off grid when it comes to water resources. It's similarly, when we talk about touristic resorts along many of the Red Sea and Mediterranean coastlines are beginning to come off grid, since they're being able to self-sustain themselves through desalination of water, through solar energy power in that capacity. So many people are moving away from reliance on the grid for its services that it is intended to supply. And many actually private sector companies are attempting to incentivize and to power this even further. I'll give a shout out to a company, if you'll allow, but Calm Solar, for instance, and Calm Water is a very big, beautiful example of how that's moving them forward towards off-grid systems that are allowing us to power the desert, not just through solar means, but also through desalination to provide water to communities that are completely off-grid. I think that we are heading towards that trajectory. It will take time. There are regulations within the government and legislation that are being set to allow that to prevail. I think, for instance, with the feed-in tariff scheme that is allowed for renewable energies, that is one incentive that the government has instigated and implemented within within the parliament, has allowed for that to happen. And that's for both solar tariffs and for wind. So that's already something that's existing and is already being implemented. I think if we start seeing more of these small scale projects, then that can be achieved. There are already as well small scale projects on biogas, biodiesel, and waste to energy systems that are being implemented within rural communities, and how those waste to energy systems are providing energy again for off-grid areas. Again, very much small scale. So scaling it to a larger scale on not just on a community level, but how can that be implemented, for instance, in governorates that really don't have access to the grid at all, can be quite beneficial. But again, I will definitely always go back to the same principle that I think has been iterated over and over by both Dr. Mohammed, engineer Mohammed Kamal, and yourself, Harry, is that including the communities and including the voices of the stakeholders in these areas is absolutely vital. That being said, I do want to add on that as Engineer Mohammed mentioned, that we've been working with the civil society since the beginning of the year on terms of COP engagement and how to train civil society specifically towards COP engagement. And through this iterative process, there's actually been, with the various workshops and trainings, there's actually been a very interesting engagement that has called for the need to write a policy paper, which has for civil society. This was seconded, of course, by the American University in Cairo, so that we could actually develop something that was based on this iterative process for a definitive policy paper based on the thematic areas that the COP presidency had ensued, which were the 17 thematic areas from water, food, energy, climate security, gender, biodiversity, and otherwise. Now, taking those workshops and building upon it with this policy paper, which is now published online at the Alternative Policy Solutions platform at AUC, many of the civil society NGOs that Engineer Mohammed Kamal has been working with have been able to use this policy paper, take the positions that were taken from much of the civil society network that was done in this iterative process throughout these workshops, and build upon it to have a more definitive position statement by these group of NGOs. And like Engineer Mohammed stated, is that it's almost impossible to be able to have a collective vision for how all of the civil society actors will have a common vision towards COP, that because everybody has their various agendas, everybody has a specific need or desire towards how they would like things to be implemented. So it's almost impossible to have a collective vision for everyone. But I'll reiterate this again, is that it's not necessary to have a collective one common vision for everyone. It is important to have a stance and where we're headed in terms of a general vision. And I think that that's what Engineer Mohammed and that group has been doing beautifully. And I think that that's something that maybe I can let him talk a little bit more about. So thank you.
That's a great idea, Lama. Thanks so much for the intervention. Engineer Mohammed, back over to you. And if in addition to the last point that Lama raised, you could also speak a little bit to local perceptions, at least among civil society, the kind of communities you engage, of whether this international discourse that you see indeed gaining some traction, of course, of demanding damages, of course, for the cumulative impact of carbon emissions over so many decades, centuries by rich industrialized countries, whether that has any traction or any whether that's at all important and resonates with civil society and with local communities, or whether that's a good example of one of those types of vocabulary that you described that is quite alien to the communities that you engage with.
I mean, the simple answer to this is the majority of the space we operate in as an environmental organization in Egypt is not connected to the global discourse. Whether that's I'm not sure if that's a bad thing or can be a positive any way or another, but there's a disconnect. And even if you bring them points on the global discourse and what people are discussing, a good example is loss and damage. There's so much work that needs to be done so that people are aligned on why loss and damage is becoming a discussion. That's one. And two, and that's one thing I was told by someone, this is not me saying it, I was told this by someone in a workshop recently, and he was just an audience member attending the workshop, that if Egypt needs a loss and damage financing facility, if that's where we're going to reach, it's probably too late. And I think an interesting perspective, because really the focus in Egypt should definitely be adaptation. If we reach a point where the damage is so substantial that we need serious loss and damage financing, it probably is a bit very late to adapt to some of those impacts. So that's something that resonated with me a bit. But if I go back to the original question, I think local organizations, one key thing that COP brought, or this space that COP brought in Egypt, is we're a little bit empowered. We hope this stays after the COP, but we've had this ability to engage with topics we previously had not. We were not aware that we have a responsibility. As a civil society organization, you have a responsibility for the target audience you represent, or for the youth you represent, or for the whatever target audience you work with, to bring their voice to these key issues, especially when the context is so important, such as the African context.
There's also some questions in the chat. I don't know if anyone feels particularly interested in picking them up, which are a bit more to do with traditional energy, of course. Egypt as well, seeking to still expand its oil and gas industry, as well as a question there by Tilly about carbon capture and sequestration, and whether that's a way forward. Is there anyone here on the panel who would like to pick up on any of those kind of questions and how that fits with our discussion here? I don't know whether it's you, Engineer Mohammed, or Lama, or Dr. Mohammed.
If I can pinpoint, it's actually piggybacking on what Engineer Mohammed was mentioning in reference to loss and damage and adaptation. And I noticed a question actually in the Q&A in reference to the Pakistan floods and how that relates to also what we're doing towards and how that relates to us on a global level, but also on a local level in Egypt. And I think this is a really important point for COP27 as well, because L&D and loss and damage is something that's going to be heavily discussed in the COP27. The statement made by the representative to Engineer Mohammed is indicative, very indicative of where we're headed. Just to be clear, so the difference between adaptation and loss and damage is adaptation is we know that there are climate impacts happening. What can we do to prevent them from happening? That's how we adapt to it. Loss and damage states that the impacts have happened, there's no going back, there's devastation. What can we do to compensate and to help those disaster relief what can we do to help mitigate? So it's more of a disaster reduction and disaster relief after the impact has already occurred. Now, this is very problematic because, again, with places like what's happening in Pakistan right now, for instance, where you have over 2 million people that have been resettled from their homes from the floods, this is a clear case of no longer adaptation. This is loss and damage. What can we begin to do? We talk about the various sectors in Egypt, which will have complete eradicated losses, whether it be the agricultural sector or the Delta being completely inundated. These are impacts of loss and damage. Can we do something in terms of adaptation to prevent them from ensuing? Many will argue they've already happened. This is already loss and damage. Many will say, well, there's still a lot more to occur, so there's adaptation. I'd argue there's two fronts here that need to be played and balanced very, very carefully. But that being said, just to also clarify that the agenda that was placed both in Glasgow and previously on L&D, that the wording doesn't state to compensate for loss and damage, it's to address loss and damage. And this is the defining factor. many people, many countries, pardon, have actually really lobbied to try and get a financing mechanism facility for loss and damage, both at Bonn and the intersessionals, and again at COP27, but as of yet have been rejected completely, both by the United States and by Europe. And it looks like will also continue to happen again in Cairo, in Sharm el-Sheikh, pardon. But that being said, arguing for it and pushing for it is imperative, because there are compensation for loss and damages, whether it be for small island states or floods in Pakistan, or devastations to occur in Egypt or anywhere in Ghana for that matter. There are compensations that need to occur. How do we manage it? How do we deal with it? It's a completely complex issue, since the climate finance that's already being pledged, that 100 billion, or not a single year since that has been pledged has that 100 billion climate finance been dispersed. The most that we've reached has been 80 billion as of yet, and that's stretching it. So I think we have a lot more to go when it comes to climate finance, whether it be on climate mitigation, adaptation. Add loss and damage to the mix, we're headed in a very scary area.
We definitely are, Lama, a very good point. As you said, even that 80 billion is with a lot of creative accounting, as we know. What the real sum of additional money of those 80 billion is a very different discussion. I saw, as I said in the Q&A, also some questions there about Egypt and hydrocarbons, but also Egypt and CCS. Was there anyone who wanted to take that up, Engineer Mohammed? Is that something you feel comfortable?
Yeah, I've had a look at the questions, and I think I might give it a shot, the questions that were directed to me. So there was a question, the first one, on the case of Egypt's oil and gas industry and public sector and gas framework, and the future and how that looks like. And I think this is a very nice segue to climate justice. The important thing to remember with climate justice, it is not just about the impacts of communities, how communities will be affected, but also the concept of just transition. I'm not going to comment on this for too long because I'm not an expert on it, so I don't want to speak on something that I'm not comfortable with. However, I can comment on the oil and gas industry in Egypt. I can tell you that Egypt will continue to exploit its resources, so as many other African countries. It will be very difficult, in my perspective, and this is a subjective view, to find a way to convince those countries that they should not use the resources for development, for economic development, for whatever, for energy, etc., without there being a viable alternative. As simple as this sounds, it's probably way more complicated and way more bureaucratic. However, it is the reality we're in. And I think Egypt is probably not the right country to look at. You can look at a lot of the other African countries where they're in more dire need of economic development from fossil fuels. So how do you plan to compensate those countries? And I know that there's now a civil society sort of movement towards pushing against those sort of industries. I'm not against or with. I'm in a position where I'm still young, I'm still exploring, I'm better understanding the narrative, but the general perception we have as civil society is, an Egyptian civil society, to give you the exact answer, we struggle to find a narrative or a discourse or a dialogue where we can bring on the public sector in Egypt and sit with them and tell them, listen, you need to reduce the amount of oil and gas you're sort of extracting. You need to shift and push your shift faster to renewable energy. They're going to easily tell us we're already doing that. What alternative will you give us for the natural gas and oil that we're missing out? Because a lot of the natural gas and oil that Egypt is extracting is exported. So this is tough for Egyptian civil society to take heads on, and that is the context we live in. Should I take a quick shot? Another question?
Sure. And if I say that the connection with the climate justice issue, sure, I think that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tough question. I'm navigating between the open questions and the answered questions, right? Or am I doing this wrong?
No. So, and again, feel free to address whatever you feel.
I'm just checking where my name, Engineer Mohammed, is wrong. And there's a question on loss and damage. Share civil society's views about loss and damage and how it may or may not figure as a priority at COP27. Loss and damage will be a priority at COP27. I'm not actively working on it. I'm actively working more on adaptation. I'm not going to speak on what's going to happen or what is currently happening. I'm not involved in that. However, generally in Egypt, or the civil society space in Egypt, is supporting of a loss and damage financing facility. How does that look like? We honestly have no opinion yet. We don't even know how realistic is this going to be in the future. That's the answer I can give here. The other question that was directed to me was a controversial question.
There's a very final recent question there about CSO in Egypt that tend to focus on raising awareness, but perhaps less on the engagement side, for example, with private sector. Is that also your experience? Is a question by Noor. about the kind of, if you like, the division of labor and the choices and the priorities made by civil society.
Okay, so the key thing to note is when we're on climate change issues, I think it's very unique that we have Lemma here or Dr. Lemma on the panel. She's one of the few people that have worked on this for a very long time in Egypt, from a civil society space. But in a civil society space, historically, there hasn't been that many figures. So when we say that there's a growing sort of civil society sector and that it's starting to become more mature and discuss more key and frontline issues that are important to Egypt. However, we're still at a very young age where we have any form of strong platform that we can force certain type of stakeholders to sit down with us on a table. Or even when they do sit on a table, there's no, or I would say this very carefully, the institutional and legal framework in Egypt for engagement with private sector and the public sector on environmental issues overall is still very fragile. And because it's fragile, or largely it's probably not very clear, there's no level. So when I go back to environmental issues, enforcement of environmental laws is weak in Egypt. And that is due to many reasons, and due to the informality of the Egyptian economy, which is a challenge that other countries face as well. This sort of vagueness from the institutional point of view is largely why we as civil society struggle to engage with certain private sector companies and other forms of stakeholders. A good example, for instance, is, I'll just throw their name out because very frustratingly, they're sponsoring the COP, Coca-Cola. So Coca-Cola does a lot of work in Egypt and funding a lot of the civil society sort of based initiatives. We are in dire need of money. So you're either going to stick by your values and not get any money. And a lot of people are questioning a lot of decisions being taken by civil society groups over the African continent. But you have to remember, we need financing for a lot of the work we want to do. Who offers this financing? The controversial Coca-Cola. And the controversial Coca-Cola, this provides us with greenwashing, but for us, it's the source of financing in front of us. And when you come up and sit with them on the table, they can easily tell you, well, I have other civil society organizations engaging with me. Why should I listen to you? Why should I engage with you? Anyway, I'll stop here on my barrage of answers for questions.
Well, thank you so much, Engineer Mohammed. It was great. It was a very, very effective barrage from where I'm sitting. Perhaps to wrap up, we'll go around one more time, perhaps for some final thoughts, some ideas in our conversation that you found useful, important, moving forward. Perhaps Dr. Mohammed, I'll start with you. Again, from your perspective, there's been a lot of discussion here about, of course, the importance of civil society, public information. Of course, part of what the Atlas work is all about, as I understand it, is need to make some of this information available, and perhaps to usher in a change from that perspective. Yeah, what would you tell us? What are some of the takeaways from your standpoint from this discussion?
Well, I think my takeaway is the need for localized action. We are we are currently supporting Alexandria Governorate to come up with its own climate change action plan. And from our work that we're doing there, you see lots of departments in the governorates dealing with climate change. But again, sometimes needing more coordination. There's private sector. There's when you look there, when we start working there. To be honest, my first impression, there might not be much happening there, but actually, after working there with them, there's actually plenty of initiative taking place there, and there's huge awareness about the importance of the topic. However, sometimes, as I mentioned, need more coordination, need more visioning about why we're doing this, how different, how we can align between what are happening at the central level by central government, what is happening, and what is the role of local government, and what is the role, I think what is clearly coming from the discussion today, what is the role of the private sector and civil society organization, and how we can better align. I think the issue of finance, again, come as the elephant in the room. There are plenty of hopes, there are plenty of needs, both on the mitigation side and the adaptation side. However, the finance part is usually an issue. It can be related to, as I mentioned, either one, the centralization, of resources, or, the lack of own source revenue of local government. For example, if I look at the government part, usually local governments in Egypt are having very, very limited resources compared to the central transfer that are channeled by both Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Planning. If you look, we did analysis to taxes, local taxes from 1980 and until last year, and so over 40 years time, there is actually a decline in the percentage of local taxes collected versus national taxes, and it's not only decline, a sharp decline in local taxes to national taxes. So and there is also, as I mentioned, also while the percentage, while the amount of investments that are done by local government is increasing, if you look at the percentage between local governments investments and central government investment, again, it's slightly decreasing. So that's on the revenue side. There are plenty of user charges and fees that by default are local. However, they are in the Egyptian context, they are centralized. There are local taxes like property tax, for instance, that are in theory local tax, but again, in the Egyptian context is but legally 75% centralized, de facto 100% centralized. So on the finance side, if I only look at the public part, there are plenty of stuff that need to happen. And I think Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Local Development are very keen to address some of these issues. We're working with both ministries to come up with a strategy for enhancing local government own source revenue and to rationalize central transfers. I think the point that Engineer Mohammed mentioned and Dr. Lama about the PPP, I cannot agree more. I think the legal framework is relatively weak. And more importantly, the practice itself and the right signals and the right incentives to local government to establish such partnership need to be strengthened. So in a nutshell, I think we need to have a clear vision and a clear policy for localized action. We need to have the right incentives made by central government, given that this central government usually in that context, you need to have two things. You have to have a local leadership that push for the agenda forward, but at the same time enabling policy and enabling legislation at the central level to support this leadership. We also need, as you know, as been discussed by the other colleagues, the convening power of both coming from the civil society and the local government officials to come together and form this partnership and discuss what actually and practically can happen between all these actors.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mohammed. Lama, coming to you, both interested in your takeaways from this conversation, but also picking up on one last question in the Q&A, which is kind of what other African states or African societies can learn from Egypt's experience so far, good and bad, and the struggles, including with organizing a COP that have come. So again, your take on that would be much appreciated as well.
Of course. I think for me, the main key takeaways is that there's a lot of the work that I see, for instance, that Dr. Mohammed is doing on the World Bank. It's fantastic. This analysis that's happening on a national level, where we can actually identify where are the key areas that we can actually put our money in. Do we need to put it in this specific district or in this specific sector, mapping out that risk analysis to be able to identify. It's fantastic work because it really does zone in and define where it is that we need as policymakers to scope in and put our money. Where is that investment? Because as you know, at the end of the day, we're a developing country, there's limited finances. So where can we really focus our money when it comes to the risks and impacts that are happening? So for me, I think that work is pivotal. And thank you, Dr. Mohammed, for sharing that with us, because I think that's crucial for us in identifying what we can really move forward and do. And then on the other side, I think that the work that Engineer Mohammed is doing in terms of really bringing together the civil societies, actors in terms of working together from the various sectors, water and agriculture and biodiesel, to come to have a common vision in terms of stakeholder engagement is pivotal. I think that kind of local support and bringing everyone together is absolutely crucial. I think that where I sort of that linkage between what sort of the government level policy can occur and between the sort of the local stakeholder actors can begin to hold. And this is where I think that the involvement of non-state actors is crucial. And when I say non-state actors, I don't just mean civil society engagement. I really do also emphasize private sector engagement in that capacity. So for instance, Engineer Mohammed was talking about Coca-Cola and how controversial they may be in terms of whether or not we look at big corporations for financing. And this is a big debate, of course. Many African, and I'll go back to your question, Harry, many African NGOs and African networks have also opted for heading that route for financing means and for big corporations. And the truth of it, there is no right or wrong answer. There's really no right or wrong answers to this. And at the end of the day, big corporations are improving their sustainability practices. And it's not just for CSR anymore or for show. There is a common vision in terms of global reporting initiatives. There's GRIs. There are specific sustainability promises, whether it be adhering to IFC's performance standards on ENS, environmental and social performances, including supply chain measures, including forced and child labor, that doesn't occur, including environmental leakages and pollution prevention. There are strict measures being implemented now by the private sector on a global scale that are forcing many of these big corps that for the longest time were criticized for their activities and their ethics contributions, that maybe now are turning a different leaf. So that is something that we need to consider. That is something that we definitely need to consider on that respect. And that is very individualistic to the NGOs and how they choose to take and how they in the trajectory that they choose to take. So I cannot comment on that particularly, but what I can say, if we're looking at a model, if the African countries and the African NGOs are looking towards Egypt in terms of lessons learned, how to move forward from what we are doing and what we hope to do, is really try to, and this is something that I think that we've been mentioning from the very beginning with Engineer Mohammed and many of the civil society actors, is that COP is not the end game. COP is the hanger, if you will. There's a saying in Arabic, it's the hanger that we choose to use in order to get the initiatives that we want to get implemented across Egypt. And then beyond then, if there's a platform that we need to have established in terms of civil society actors having a platform to engage and network and discuss, then let's establish it now for COP so that it can continue to engage and work and practice after COP. If we need to have a platform for ministry level representatives from the Ministry of Environment and Water and Ag to communicate with the NGOs for COP related climate initiatives, then let's establish it so that they can continue after COP and have that engagement for stakeholder engagement on projects, related activities and policy making after COP. COP is not the end game. COP is the opportunity that we're trying to capitalize on, and I'll say capitalize as a capitalist here. Let's capitalize on the COP as much as possible for all the initiatives that we really are trying to do, so that what comes after COP will be extremely rewarding when it comes to the environmental movement in Egypt. And if there's any lesson learned, is that's what we really want to try to achieve.
All right, excellent. Mohammed, final words for you.
Well, I'll probably answer one more of the questions. I think there was a question on carbon capture.
There was.
And answer this very quickly, and I'll give a concluding note. So the question on carbon capture, I'll probably just bounce back the question on what is the incentive for the Egyptian government to take on carbon capture technology to reduce its emissions from the oil and gas sector. As simple as some of the incentive might seem, they're usually not straightforward yet. And until carbon capture technology becomes more mainstreamed in the sector, Egypt will then start to adopt it. You largely see that many of the sectors in Egypt base the way they operate based on other sectors. I'll take it then to another step, the energy sector in Egypt. When we look at a lot of the hydrocarbons, and also now moving towards the green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, all the colors of hydrogen that are coming now to the sector, the important thing to note here is there is an energy security problem in Europe. And Egypt is probably going to have might have an energy security problem in the future. At the moment, we don't. So what drives our shift to more renewable energy for the local level is very different to what would drive our shift to the energy we export. So if more of the demand for our energy that we export is demanding more renewable energy, you'll start to see more renewable energy being in place and a shift happen. but there's still a lot of demand, and demand rules. And that's the thing that is happening now with hydrogen, where a lot of the European countries are interested to invest in North African countries to provide them with an alternative energy source. So my point here is demand dictates, and it's not, and our place in civil society is extremely hard to take these topics head on. My concluding note for COP27. So COP27 is championed as the African COP, and Egypt is hosting it to represent Africa. The African continent is facing a multitude of issues, and a lot of these issues all stem down to a lot of economic challenges that different countries are facing, whether stemmed from social issues, from conflict, from complicated political situations. The key thing to note always is that climate change will come and exacerbate all of this. And that's what already is happening. You'll find that climate change is making situations worse in countries like Somalia. You'll find that climate change is making the poverty situation in Egypt becoming much more difficult to deal with, because a lot of areas that were habitable in a very uninhabited country, when you look at Egypt overall, we have a lot of desert that's empty, becomes way less habited. We have less space that we can actually occupy as humans. So what do we want from COP as Egyptian civil society? I think what we want from COP, as the COP presidency has mentioned, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the presidency or supporting what they're saying, what I'm saying is they mentioned implementation, and they've mentioned this in multiple times, whether through media or what they have said, multiple representatives of the presidency have said over the past couple of months. I think for the African context, and especially for the context in Egypt, we need to start seeing more tangible impact. And I'm going to conclude with a lot of the climate finance or the green finance that has been implemented in the region. I'm not going to only focus on Egypt. As a civil society representative, I struggle to find the impact of these projects. So it's not only about we need more money. Egypt needs more money. Simple as that. We do. But what will we do with our money when we get it? And this is key. And I think this is also a key part of the negotiations. And implementation will dictate how this money will transform into tangible, impactful projects. So from COP27, our very small hope, I'm not a very optimistic person about COPs in general. I haven't even been involved in them that long, but it doesn't seem like a very optimistic space. But the very small expectation I have is we need a modality for implementing projects. The current modalities are very weak. So if you're going to start doing climate finance, and climate finance is funneling mega projects in countries across Africa, there needs to be a clear modality that is not led by the funder, it needs co-led. And there's also active contribution from the local or the national beneficiary of that funding.
Thank you so much, Engineer Mohammed. This was an excellent note, I think, to conclude on. On the whole, I've really very much enjoyed this discussion. I take it from the very lively Q&A that many people joining us here today also have taken advantage of the opportunity to listen to the three of you and seeing your interaction. And I must say also, Engineer Mohammed, your point about the hydrogen is a particularly good one, because one of the next installments of this series will focus very much on various African perspectives on hydrogen and what it may and may not mean for the continent, and questions of energy security, but also relatedly, of course, its position in the global economy, questions of water, etc., etc. For those of you watching, if you want to watch this again, do take advantage of the fact that this recording will be made available on our YouTube channel and will be disseminated via the various social media channels of the Central and Global Energy Policy. Let me thank you, the audience, for watching, for your questions, for your engagement. But above all, let me thank you, Dr. Mohammed, Dr. Lama, and Engineer Mohammed. This has been an excellent conversation. I very much enjoyed it, and I hope we'll have the opportunity to do it again, perhaps on the other side of this particular COP. Thank you so much, and I wish you a wonderful rest of the day, wherever you are around the world. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thanks a lot.